So what I say is, no, Russia is not winning. But what I would say is, as President Zelensky has said, as the European leaders have said, we are at an important moment. Do you stand with Ukraine's defense over this winter? Do you walk away? Or do you even say, you know what? I think Vladimir Putin's the guy I want to do my economic projects with.
Scott Lucas, professor at the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Hey, thanks, Maddie. What type of craziness are we talking about today?
I know it feels like forever since I've had you on the show. It's just when it's not, in a consecutive week, it really throws me off. But there's so much to discuss. And as the viewers and audience will probably understand, it's been very central about Russia-Ukraine this week because there is so much back and forth on negotiating a peace deal. But just to get your thoughts on something, President Zelensky, he was set to show a new peace agreement that he drafted with the UK, Germany and France, show it to the United States. So the peace framework has been streamlined down to about 20 points after removing some elements that Ukraine found that favoured Russia and that was unfavourable to Ukrainians. So have we heard yet if the United States has seen it?
No, we have not had confirmation that it's been delivered to the United States. Zelensky said he hoped it would be with the Americans by Tuesday night. But even if the Americans had received it, the Trump camp right now are so intent on putting pressure on Zelensky to capitulate. They're not going to make that their priority. I mean, just a reminder for the viewers, because sometimes this gets confused in media coverage. We've got two different proposals that are out there. The original proposal was a 28-point proposal, and that's the one that was crafted by the Kremlin with Donald Trump's envoys, son-in-law Jared Kushner, real estate developer Steve Witkoff. That was Kremlin ideas from April, but it was developed in late October in exchange for the possibility of joint U.S.-Russian economic projects. The Trump camp forced Ukraine to give up territory, notably the rest of the Donetsk region in the east. They banned Ukraine from joining NATO. They put limits on its troops and strict restrictions on Western military support. The U.S. gets 50% of profits from Ukraine's recovery fund. Meanwhile, Russia gets lifting of sanctions, G8 membership, amnesty for war crimes. The second proposal is different. It's not just amending the U.S. proposal. It's a counter proposal that the Europeans put at the start of November. And the start of November, the pushback was, look, you start with a ceasefire. Okay, we'll discuss the territory, the political issues, the economic issues, but you start with that ceasefire on the current front lines. Russia does not get territory that it does not occupy at the moment. Ukraine is not banned from NATO, although it will not join in the near future. But Western military assistance continues as part of security guarantees. Oh, yes. And the U.S. does not get that 50% of profits from Ukraine's recovery fund, that economic sweetener that the Trump camp want. Oh, and Russia does not get amnesty for war crimes, given that Vladimir Putin is on the hook with a warrant, an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. So two competing proposals. What Zelensky did after he met European leaders on Monday and Tuesday is he restated the three elements of that European counter proposal. That is, you get a ceasefire and a settlement, you get security guarantees, and you get Ukraine's reconstruction. Meanwhile, Donald Trump is lashing out at Zelensky, and that's the public face of an effort by the purported envoy and real estate developer Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to press Zelensky to give up. But he's not going to give up. Zelensky's not going to give up. And what was really important to me over the past 2 days was that the Europeans did not buckle. He went to London, UK's Keir Starmer, Germany's Friedrich Merz, France's Emmanuel Macron. He then went to Brussels, met Mark Rutte, head of NATO, Ursula von der Leyen, European Commission President, European Council President Antonio Costa. He goes, meets the Pope in the Vatican yesterday, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni last night, all of them supporting Ukraine because, Maddie, I'm going to widen this out. This has not only become a question of Ukraine's survival because of some developments in the Trump camp, especially this so-called national security strategy. This is now an imminent crisis over European security and European leaders effectively saying, we may not be able to count on the Trump camp because they have ended their alliance with us. So no matter how much they press Zelensky, they have to stay behind him. They cannot buckle.
So this week, Trump has been a lot tougher on Europe than he has been on Russia. So he's told Politico that Europe is weak. He said, I also think they want to be so politically correct. I think they don't know what to do. What they're doing with immigration is a disaster. And then he spoke on ending the Russia-Ukraine war. He said they talk, but they don't produce. And the war just keeps going on and on. I mean, 4 years now. It's been going on long before I got here. So this prompted the European Council President Antonio Costa, who you mentioned, to ask Trump to show some respect. So he said, we respect the choice of Americans and that they need to respect the democratic choices of our citizens. When all the leaders elect me president of the European Council, President Trump must respect this. So as we respect the Americans, citizens elected the president of the United States, I'd like basically for all of our allies to behave with each other. So, I mean, there's a lot of cracks forming between the Europeans and the US.
Cards on the table. Most serious moment since 1945 for the U.S.-European relationship, and this goes beyond Ukraine. And let's start off with the fundamentals. There is no longer an alliance, at least between the Trump camp. There are some Trump administration officials still supporting Europe, but there's no longer an alliance between the Trump camp and Europe. Indeed, the Trump camp sees Russia as a potential partner. They see the European Union and European countries as a threat. I need to go back to that national security strategy document that they issued a few days ago. It just so happens, as part of my work over many, many years, I've actually studied these development of national security strategies during the Cold War and beyond. And the bedrock of this always was a U.S. alliance with Europe. You can understand why when you talk about facing the Soviet Union. These are genuine strategies in terms of geopolitics, military, economic, even cultural dynamics. This national security strategy by the Trump administration is not a strategy. It's a worldview of certain Trump advisors. And I'm going to say that I'm pretty sure J.D. Vance is the driving force here, the vice president. And let me identify the core of this. At the heart of this is the idea, a conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement Conspiracy Theory. Now, this is a far-right conspiracy theory. We used to associate it with the Fox TV broadcaster Tucker Carlson, who isn't a friend of Trump. We associate with certain far-right groups in Europe, Germany's AfD, the National Rally in France, for example. And what it says here is that white citizens in Europe are being overrun by non-white immigrants. The national security strategy amplifies that conspiracy theory. They talk about Europe's civilizational erasure. So what you have here is not a U.S. security issue. You have a view which is a far-right, white nationalist view being promoted, because not only is this view out there in terms of tactics, the strategy says we're going to break up the European Union. We are actually going to challenge current European democratic systems by supporting European nationalists. And by European nationalists, they mean far-right groups. So the United States is now in a position not just of not being allied with Europe, but of trying to undermine or even topple governments in Europe. And I'm going to take you back to this because it's a provocative claim to make, but I'm going to pin it down. In February, you might remember J.D. Vance went to the Munich Security Conference. And he gave that studs up speech, really provocative, which effectively said, Europe isn't fit to exist these days, and you're on your own, boys, right? Subsequent to that, or immediately after that, at the Munich conference, J.D. Vance sat down with Alice Weidel, who is one of the leaders of Germany's Alliance for Deutschland, longtime far-right party. Those contacts continued. By the summer, J.D. Vance was not only talking to the Germans, and by the way, Elon Musk is a big fan of Alice Weidel as well, going back to the spring. During the summer, J.D. Vance pitches up in the United Kingdom, in the Cotswold, and he talks to hard-right conservative politicians and, of course, the leaders of the Reform Party, because the Trump people want to put the Reform Party in and get rid of the Labour government in the UK. So this is now. If any other country was doing this, the Russians, the Chinese, whatever, we would call it subversion, or we would call it interference. This is actually what the Trump people are promoting as a strategy. And of course, Ukraine gets bound up in this because if you don't believe in European security, if you don't believe in the European Union, why should you believe in Ukraine? Why should you not let Russia just simply sweep through Ukraine and strike business deals with it on a bilateral basis?
And that's what Costa was saying. He was basically telling Donald Trump, stay out of European politics. We don't do that to you. Don't do it to us. But I want to stick on this strategy, security strategy. So the White House, as you mentioned, Scott, it released its national security strategy late last week. It was very much an America First agenda, criticized Europe, was a little bit softer on Russia, but it was also indicating that any involvement from the US in any conflict has to be in American interest. So with security guarantees for Ukraine still up in the air, the release of this strategy and pressure on EU nations to increase their defense spending. Today, we saw Republican Congressman Thomas Massie say that he's introduced a bill to end US NATO membership. He called it a Cold War relic. I mean, will this spark the end of NATO for the United States?
We wait and see. I mean, Tom Massie, we talked about Tom Massie quite a bit because, of course, he led the charge against the administration over the Epstein files. And he actually criticized the Trump people over the budget. But he comes from a faction within the Republican Party, which is the old throwback to the isolationist, right? Sometimes it's masked as libertarianism. You'll see it also in his fellow Kentuckian, the Senator Rand Paul, right? And that is, we should not be tied up with anyone else. So they're rejecting the whole post-1945 alliance system. So I'm not surprised to see Massie see this. I think that's distinct, that Massie view, from what I'm talking about here with the Trump folks, because of the Trump folks, at least this section of the administration, and beyond J.D. Vance, I would talk about Witkoff, I would talk about Kushner, I would talk about a lot of the political appointees that Trump has put in. This isn't America first. This is two things. One is it's profit first. So don't underestimate the economic dimension. So when you talk to them cozying up to Russian, they think they can make more money out of Russia than they can out of Ukraine. I mean, it's as blunt as that. But secondly, it's far right first. We need to be honest here. This is a far right authoritarian government in the United States now. And I know what those words mean. And that far right authoritarian government, in their belief that they are not bound by law, they are not bound by the courts, they're not bound by Congress even, they're certainly not bound by the agencies, who they can demolish if they want to. They're not bound by the media. They look for partners abroad who are the same way. So this is not just America first. This is America and Orban in Hungary. This is America and the AfD in Germany. They wanted it to be America and Meloni in Italy, but she has not proven to be that far-right ideologue. She's much more a pragmatist. They want it to be the America and the National Rally in France, and they would like it to be, for economic reasons, and because Trump actually likes the authoritarian, they would like it to be America and the Kremlin. Now, this was not just Antonio Costa that called this out. Let me point you to, I think, a couple of even more important statements, Maddie. Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, longtime supporter of the transatlantic relationship. And you know that this was central to the rebirth of what was then West Germany and later Germany in the Cold War. Merz, when he met Zelensky with the other leaders on Monday, and then again on Tuesday, said, we have to rely on ourselves. We can no longer count on the United States. The Pope Leo XIV, who is American, from Chicago, when he met Zelensky yesterday, said that this national security strategy is a threat to the relationship between the U.S. and Europe. And he called out Donald Trump over Donald Trump's language, which also threatened the alliance. So there is a recognition across Europe now that we are at a vital point in terms of whether there is a partnership with the United States for security or whether the Trump camp are going to ally with others who might be adversaries. I will emphasize in this that there are those within the Trump administration who do not want to follow this Trump strategy.
Well, I was going to say, Scott, and the thing is, what is not controversial from the Trump camp is this pressure on EU nations to increase their defense spending. That is not controversial. That has been a really good thing to come out of these negotiations from the Trump administration to say, you should not be relying on us. You should be increasing your defense spending, understanding that this is a war on your own doorstep. So that has been good. The controversial part is moving away from your longtime allies and moving towards an agenda that does mirror the Kremlin. But you mentioned Republicans who aren't on board with this. Now, we know that the Republican Party is divided over foreign policy, especially how best Trump engage with Putin and what he asks of President Zelensky. So Trump has grown frustrated with Ukraine in the last few weeks, believing that their inability to accept concessions like territory is what's holding back from a peace deal. But here's what Republican Congressman Joe Wilson, he wrote on X. He said, Ukraine has accepted all 6 proposals presented by President Trump this year. Russia has accepted 0. Putin is mocking Trump and buying time to keep killing Ukrainian families, ensuring hundreds of thousands more Russian men die in trenches for perverted lies. That is the truth. Zelensky has accepted deals. Putin hasn't.
Yeah. And so let me take this to the heart of, all right, this is the fundamental, that Vladimir Putin is not going to stop. He's not going to give Trump his Nobel Peace Prize until he is either given or he overruns more of Ukraine and he gets rid of the Zelensky government. He's not going to stop. Okay. What does that mean for the Republican Party? Where you talk about some people are going, wait a minute, where are we positioned on this? Let me say something on your previous point just to reinforce this, because I think it has to be framed. When Donald Trump called on NATO members to spend more money, getting up to at that point 2.5%, 3% of GDP, it's now 5%. It wasn't because Donald Trump believed in an alliance. We need to knock this on the head. It's because Donald Trump didn't want to pay. He did not want the United States to pay into NATO. He wanted to, in effect, say, you pay for all of that. That's what Trump's like as a businessman. It's what he's like in other grounds, right? So he doesn't want out of the U.S. pocket, which is his pocket. Now, NATO had a commitment since 2014 that they were going to ramp up defense spending. They were slow on doing it. But they did that during the first Trump administration while Trump was walking away from Europe, threatening to walk away from NATO. And remember, when he blackmailed Ukraine in 2019. So this idea that Trump was doing this as part of a partnership with NATO, let's knock this back, because that raises the question for the Republicans now. Can you get this Trump camp back into NATO, back into Europe to provide for security, or are they too far gone? That's going to raise the question, because I talked about a divided administration. It's going to raise the question for Marco Rubio as a Secretary of State. It's going to raise the question, not for Pop Gun Pete Hegseth over at Defense, but it's going to raise it for every member of the military, civilian personnel, or the actual forces who have long believed that you need that U.S.-European relationship. It's going to raise the question for every member of the U.S. intelligence agencies who have worked with the Europeans for 75 years. It's going to raise it for U.S. economic agencies. In other words, we're going to come down to a fundamental battle on 2 levels. One is the Trump camp versus its own agencies, and then second, the Republican Party. We get voices like Lindsey Graham, who's a friend of Donald Trump. I'm going to have sanctions on Russia. I'm going to be tough on Russia. Where are those sanctions on Russia that Lindsey has promised for months?
Well, I agree with you, Scott, but it's clear as day that Trump is stonewalling that. Lindsey Graham has 85 co-sponsors in the Senate. He said he's going to take it to the Senate floor for a vote. I can't remember the name of the congressman, but he said that he was going to rally up the troops in Congress to vote for it when it would go to them as well. But Trump said, well, Lindsey Graham came out maybe a month ago and said that Trump had said that, now is the time, let's do this. And then as predicted, it falls off the radar when peacekeeping negotiations happen again, because it's rinse and repeat. This is exactly what Putin does. He gets wind of the fact that, the US is potentially going to slap 500% tariffs on any country importing Russian oil, and that it's about to hit the Senate floor. And he says, all right, I'm ready to negotiate. But Scott, we need to move on because I want to ask you something. Marco Rubio, he recently spoke about Donald Trump's patience on the war. So he said the president is very committed to peace, but his patience is not infinite. So this week we've had a lot of conversations after Donald Trump Jr.'s comments about whether Trump would walk away from the negotiating table. So what do you think that moment will be if it does happen that Trump decides to walk away?
First of all, I don't give a flying fig about Donald Trump Jr. and the rest of the media shouldn't either. Okay. I'm not going to go any further than that, but I don't consider him to be reliable on any issue of substance. Remember, this is a man who tried to annex Greenland a few months ago, as America's 51st state. So back in your box, son. It is far more important what Marco Rubio has said, because I've just talked about that administration fight. What Rubio is doing is Rubio's walking a tightrope here, right? Rubio, on the one hand, does not like the direction of travel of the Trump camp. He doesn't like what it means for Ukraine, for Europe. On the other hand, publicly, Rubio cannot come out and face off against Trump, because if he does, he's out. I mean, that's what Trump's going to do. So what Rubio does is publicly, he keeps on those lines which tell, Ukraine and Europe, look, you got to give something to us. You got to give something to us, right? But then privately, he is there as part of the discussion around those counter proposals I referred to. And I'm just a quick reminder, we saw this in a month ago, because when that ultimatum, Witkoff, Kushner, the Kremlin, came up and was going to be discussed in Geneva, Rubio went to legislators, and of course he's a former senator, and they were going to Canada for a security conference, and he said, "Look, this is a Russian proposal. This isn't ours." And that's what they went before the press, and they told them that, right? So they effectively undercut the Kremlin ultimatum and Witkoff and Kushner. Now, of course, Rubio, after the legislators came out, said, "Oh, no, I didn't brief them. It wasn't me," whatever. Publicly, he's still going to maintain deniability in terms of this. I hold to this, that a lot of the pushback against Donald Trump finally putting himself alongside Vladimir Putin and the other far-right authoritarians are the people that you will not see in the headlines. The working level people who handle diplomacy, intelligence, military affairs, economic affairs, but they need someone who's a frontline representative. And if Rubio is pushed out, I'm not sure who that frontline representative is. And at that point, what is currently an alert becomes a 5 alarm alert, that there are no adults left at the highest levels.
So, Scott, your kind of takeaway is the moment that Donald Trump walks away from the negotiating table will probably go part and parcel with if Rubio is really still in the room.
Yeah, I think so. I think the fact is that if Rubio goes, you probably see the walk. Now, here's the serious impact to get to the day-to-day level. Because look, what I'm watching very carefully is that because of Rubio, because of other adults in the room, of course, Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine's out in January, they were able to pull back that. When Trump did walk away, Trump had walked away back this spring. No military support of any kind, no political support, calling Zelensky a dictator, trying to humiliate him. They not only got Ukraine and Europe back into the discussions, so it's not a U.S.-Russia, imposing this on Kyiv. They also got a restoration of U.S. military supplies to Ukraine via sales to NATO members. And they also got the restoration of intelligence sharing. If you get a cutoff of the intelligence sharing, which is vital both in terms of maintaining the front line in Ukraine and also those counterattacks inside Russia, and if you get a suspension of the scheme of U.S. weapons being sold to NATO members, that's when you've got Trump trying to enable a Kremlin victory, finally. Because again, we're looking probably, I still think a 6 to 12 month window. I think Putin's got 6 to 12 months. Because of their own economic issues we can discuss in the next podcast. But at this point, he's counting on Trump. He's counting on Trump to completely cut the U.S. away from Ukraine. And we're now at that balancing moment right now. And I would say that the reason why I've been so forthright with you is because that national security strategy. Look, Donald Trump says crazy crap. I mean, he just had a Truth Social post we won't even have time to consider, which shows that he's not mentally stable. But the national security strategy is not just Trump. They are people who are stable, but who are pernicious, who have no interest in your welfare, in mine, or in anybody on the European continent, except for their buddies, who are the authoritarians that they admire.
Scott, Trump, he did a recent interview with Politico, and here's what he said about the status of the war. So he said Russia has the upper hand and always did. They're much bigger, they're much stronger in that sense. I give Ukraine a lot of credit, basically, those words, and bravery for fighting and all of that. But, at some point, size will win. So here's what I want to get to. So Russia is losing thousands of troops a week. they have a targeted social media campaign circulating over Telegram, trying to recruit foreign soldiers from, Asia and Africa. They have a dwindling economy where paying soldiers could become harder if sanctions continue or are increased. And Russia has only gained 1% of land since November 2022, which analysts believe only happened because the Biden administration were restricting the use of aid and weapons. So they could have actually even gained less if, they were allowed to shoot inside of Russia, etc. So yes, while the population of Russia is of course a lot bigger and that they have nuclear weapons, is it fair to say that Russia has the upper hand?
You know the answer to this. Look, first off, Donald Trump don't know diddly squat about Ukraine. Okay, he don't know. Donald Trump somebody whispers in his ear, "Oh, the Russians are winning," and he comes out and pulls out the stuff. You just laid out some of the facts, and that is that at a cost of more than 1.3 million casualties, the Russians, who had around 18% of Ukraine in 2022, have now got around about 19.5, 19.7. They've increased it a little bit this year. The Institute for the Study of War says they took about 0.9 of 1% this year. Okay? But that is with all the increased effort they've made to try to break the Donetsk region in the east. And remember, I say this every interview, after 17 months, and despite Vladimir Putin lying a few weeks ago, the Russians still do not control the city of Pokrovsk in Donetsk. After 17 months, they don't control it. They have taken, I think, 4 cities and towns in Donetsk since May of 2023. The front line is not moving that rapidly. Now, the missile and drone attacks on Ukraine, on their civilians, trying to break their resistance, are exacting a toll on the energy infrastructure. You now have blackouts, rolling blackouts of around 12 to 14, even to 16 hours in most of Ukraine, because they're trying to manage their energy supplies. That is a threat. Could they be completely blacked out? That's where Europe comes in. Can they support Ukraine's energy sector? But then you've got to go to the wider perspective. Ukraine is counterattacking inside Russia. I've just updated a few minutes before I talked to you that one of Russia's largest oil refineries in the Samara region has been knocked out of service since last Friday because of a drone strike. This happens on an almost daily basis, that an oil refinery is knocked out, a chemical plant, a petrochemical plant, an electronics plant, a railway hub, a port facility. Those Ukrainian attacks are part of a wider challenge for the Russian economy, which going into the 5th year of the invasion has flatlined, has an inflation rate which officially is around about 10%, but unofficially, according to the LSE and according to European and Ukrainian partners, is between 20 and 25%. They have an increasing budget deficit. They have issues regarding certain resources that are running short. I am not saying Russia's going to collapse. Hello, YouTube commenters who come in every time and try to undercut this. I'm not saying Russia's going to collapse. I'm saying that they have constraints on their invasion that are going to continue to tighten as long as, reminder, the U.S. sanctions on Russia's oil companies and their largest customers remain. Final statistic. Russia's oil revenues are down this year. From January, they're down 33%. Estimates are they may be down up to 50% by the end of the year because their customers don't want U.S. secondary sanctions. China, India, Turkey. If that happens, that is a huge challenge for the Kremlin. So what I say is, no, Russia is not winning. But what I would say is, as President Zelensky has said, as the European leaders have said, we are at an important moment. Do you stand with Ukraine's defense over this winter? Do you walk away? Or do you even say, you know what? I think Vladimir Putin's the guy I want to do my economic projects with.
Professor Scott Lucas, thank you for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you, Maddie.